Like one of them. Okay, wine, beer, or whiskey. How many like wine? Whiskey. I'm with you. Single malt, though. Beer. Oh, it's close between wine and beer. Let's do wine. Okay? See, what would you call the process of making wine? I know in beer you'd be brewing, in whiskey you'd be distilling. What would fermenting? Okay. Let's say you don't grow the grapes. Let's just make it a little bit easier. Someone sends you the grapes. So you have two processing in your winemaking process. Fermentation and bottling. First of all, what's our time frame here? How long does it take to do this whole thing? What's that? A year? I mean, if it was whiskey, I could talk about it. It's going to be 15 years, 12 years at the minimum. But you say about, why don't we say 1 year? And bottling is, yeah, this is not to scale. Bottling is what? 10 minutes, right? So, first thing you could say is that something like this takes a long period of time to do. It's a year, but it doesn't start January 1st and end December 31st. It crosses over years. It certainly crosses over months if your period is a month. Direct materials. In the fermentation process, where do you add the direct materials when you're making wine? What's that? At the beginning, right? You'll add what? What do you add for wine? Some grapes? Anything else get added? Like in beer, it would be a series of things you'd add here, right? Hops and malt and all that, water. Is that the only place it's added? We're doing a high-end wine, or we're doing like Gallo? Because, you know, somewhere in here they may be adding some sulfates. Some apple flavor, is that what you're suggesting? But you might add some sulfates in here, maybe not. What else might you add? Sugar? Well, in low-end wines, they might add some sugar. Okay, and I'll put a box on these because these may or may not be added. On a high-end wine, they're not going to do that. How about so this is direct materials. How about in bottling, where's the material? It's happening so fast, right? It's all pretty much here, the bottle and the label, right? Okay, how about direct labor? How's that added? What's that? So there's some right here upon receipt. You're checking them and you're putting them into the vat. I'm going to guess direct labor is kind of like this. You know, throughout you have the guy who's coming in and checking to make sure that things are going as planned. Over the course of time, maybe turning the bottle, turning it a quarter along the way, etc. Then you have overhead. How's that applied? Probably throughout as well, right? Your overhead. You know, the people come in and make sure that everything's scrubbed down so you have a clean environment. The temperature sensors, if you don't have something that's below the ground that's keeping it cool. Bottling, probably not a whole lot of labor here, just the inspectors. So it's probably happening throughout, as is the overhead. So this is a process type of model. And it's fairly normal for most processes. They go through multiple departments. The process, this is elongated, but even non-elongated process, it might span multiple periods of time. Direct materials are generally added at the beginning of each department or each process, with the possibility of adding more direct materials along the way. But clearly you need materials at the beginning. And generally speaking, labor and overhead happens throughout. So this is how a process environment works. And let's have that image in mind as we talk about it. The key thing about process costing is that it spans time. It's a continuous flow, and you need to apply costs to individual units of a continuous process. And so there are two ways of doing it, the weighted average and the FIFO ways, and they are mathematically intensive, and so this is the mathematical portion of today. We'll also talk about it within a given department to make it simple, and then we'll take it to multiple departments. So in our overall costing systems, we're up here. Process costing. So your challenge is you want to assign total costs to identical units of product. Each unit receives the same amount or a similar amount of materials, labor, and overhead. And so you just want to allocate the costs to each unit. As we said, these would be commodity products that pass through a series of similar processes. These would be cost leaders, mass production, chemicals, oil refining, etc. As we talked about, I think when we talked about job costing, conversion cost is just a term of combining overhead and direct labor. For a lot of process companies, direct materials are the primary cost, and overhead and direct labor are relatively small. There's somebody watching the factory floor, but they're not doing a whole lot in today's world. And so, even though the labor might be considered direct labor, it's treated the same way you treat overhead. And so, for simplicity, you might see it called a conversion cost. And if the costs of direct labor and overhead are incurred at the same rate in the department, you would combine them. If they have a different rate of occurrence, maybe labor is more intensive at the beginning because you have to get things going, then you would not combine them. So you might see conversion cost, you might see overhead and direct labor separate. Direct materials can be either at discrete points or continuous. In the winemaking, we saw there's direct materials at the beginning and potentially some direct materials later on. If it's continuous, then you treat it the same way you treat overhead and direct labor. If it's discrete, it's primarily at the beginning of the process, and you treat it differently, and we'll see that. From an accounting perspective, for job order costing, there's a single work in process account. For process costing, there's a separate work in process account for each department that's maintained. Other differences, I said that one already. We talked about the job cost sheet is how you accumulate the costs in job costing. In process costing, you'll see there's something called a production cost report that does the same thing. For job costing, you're accumulating per job. In process, you're accumulating per period, because you don't have a specific job to accumulate for. The unit costs in job costing is you have a job that may produce one unit or many units of something. If it's producing many units, you just take the cost of the job and divide it by the number of units you produced. In process costing, you take the total costs and divide it by the units produced in that period. Okay. Answer true or false to these questions. A law firm is likely to use process costing for major lawsuits. True or false? What do we say? False. It would be a job. A manufacturer of paintballs is likely to use process costing. True? False? True it is. Paintballs it's a continuous flow kind of process. It doesn't have to be a liquid, even though paintballs have a liquid inside, to be a process. Process costing does not keep track of overhead. True or false? False. Of course. So, essentially, same kind of flow into each departmental work in process account for each of the categories of inventory. Now, at the end of a period, some of your goods are going to be in the middle of being done. So we've come up with a concept called equivalent units to handle that situation. Equivalent units, which takes all of your partially completed product and associates it as if it were fully completed. And we'll see that math. So if you have 2 units of something, each of them 50% completed, you have 1 equivalent unit of completed goods. That's all we're saying. And so from the perspective of calculating the number of units produced, you need to think about your equivalent units produced. So if your wine, and you have 100 gallons of wine, is 75% complete, then it's 75 gallons of equivalent units of wine. Okay? You calculate your cost per equivalent unit in a process world. It's your total cost divided by the number of equivalent units in a period. And there are 2 ways to do it. The easier way and the less easy way. We wouldn't teach the less easy way unless it was a little bit better, right? So this one is more precise. FIFO is more precise than weighted average. And as you compute your cost per equivalent unit, you do it for each input. So you have a direct materials cost per equivalent unit, you have a direct labor cost per equivalent unit, and you have an overhead cost per equivalent unit. And if you combine direct labor and overhead, you then would just have conversion cost instead. Okay, so you work for the president of Rutgers. She asks you to compute the cost of instruction per full-time equivalent student. You have the following information. You want the cost of instruction per student. The total cost of instruction is $9 million. You have 900 full-time students and 1,000 part-time students. Do you think are you guys up to calculating the cost per student? You're missing a piece of information, right? What are you missing?
The period, duration.
How much, approximately, what percentage of a full-time student is a part-time student? Right? We just know they're part-time. Are they 25% student or are they 75% students? They're 60% students. Now, do you have enough information? Okay, let's see if we can do this together. What's our number of full-time students? 900. What's our number of equivalent units of part-time students? It's 0.6 times 1,000. So that's another 600. So our full-time equivalent students we have 1,500 full-time equivalent students at Rutgers, according to these numbers. So then your cost of instruction per full-time equivalent student is $9 million divided by 1,500, or 6,000. That's essentially what we're going to be doing, just not as simplistic. Okay, so okay, got it. Weighted average or FIFO. What weighted average does, you have these partially completed units from the previous period. It just counts them in your costs. So it smooths the cost, takes the weighted average, although it includes those partially completed units from the previous period in your calculations of cost. It uses those costs, it uses those equivalent units. The result is from period to period you have smoothing, which is what weighted averages do. They smooth from period to period. You have a smoothing of your analyses. FIFO, more precisely, only includes the costs incurred and work performed during this period. You have to subtract out the costs associated with the previous unit's work. Visually, what that says is you're trying to determine the costs per unit in June. That's what this says. Well, at the end of May, on June 1st, you have some units that are in some level of completion, a percentage completion for each of the three characteristics: materials, labor, and overhead. During June, you complete a bunch of stuff. You complete the units that you had in process. You start some new units that you complete. And then you start some units that you get to a certain percentage on that will be completed in July. So those are your three categories of stuff that's happening in June. Weighted average, this bracket here, considers everything you've done in June, plus for simplicity's sake, doesn't take this stuff out. It just counts the stuff that was done in May for the units completed in June. The FIFO method subtracts that stuff out. One more extra step, more precise. To really understand June's costs, it's more precise. Okay. What are our steps here? We'll account for the physical units first. How many were started, how many were left over from last period, etc. Second, we'll calculate the equivalent units based upon the physical units. Third, we'll figure out the costs for each cost element. Cost elements being direct materials, labor, and overhead. We'll calculate the cost per equivalent unit. And then we'll assign them to our accounting units, which are completed units and work in process. Work in process will be completed next period. Step one. We'll do the first one together. And then you guys can do the second one. Step one is to calculate physical units. And this is exactly the same whether you're doing FIFO or weighted average approach. So you started with 80,000 units that were left over from the previous period. You started 60,000 more units this period, and you completed 75,000 units this period. How many units are still out there to be completed next period? And the way you calculate that is starting WIP plus units started in the period are equal to completed units plus ending WIP. Okay, so that's the equation. So for the one in blue, starting WIP is 80,000. That's how many came in from the previous period. You started 60,000. You completed 75,000. So this is 140,000. So this ending work in process would have to be 65,000. Okay? What's the answer to the second one, the green one? What's starting WIP? What's starting WIP?
5,500.
Okay. Unit started is the question mark, right? What's the completed units?
73.
And what's the ending WIP? So 73 and 34 is 10,700 minus 5,200. Is that what you had? Okay? So that's the process of calculating your physical units. Same for FIFO and weighted average. Starting in the next step, it gets different. And so calculating equivalent units. We'll do weighted average here using we'll do what FIFO there. Oh, damn it. Let's use those numbers. Well, we can't. Sorry. I have to bring this back. Because we don't know the percentage completion of your starting and ending. Too soon. We okay with this? Got it? Okay, here we go. We know the beginning work in process was 2,000 units, 100% completed for direct materials because they were done at the beginning of that process last month, and 50% completed for conversion costs because we're halfway through the process. We know we completed 44,000 units this period, and we know our ending WIP is 3,000. So which of the four numbers don't we have? How many units were started? How many units were started? Remember how to do that? Beginning WIP plus units started equal units completed and ending WIP. So 45,000 units started. Okay. So we know we completed 44,000 units. We know that 2,000 units of those 44 came from last period, right? So the first thing we did is complete 2,000 units. That were already in process. And then we had a total of 44,000. So we started and completed 42,000 units, right? Because we completed a total of 44,000. 2,000 of those were from last period and 42 that we started and completed this period. And so then we started and did not complete 3,000. Okay? Sure. We know we started 45,000 units, right? Do you know where that came from? Yeah. So you have to cover a total of 47,000 units were started or were in process before. 45,000 that you started now, 2,000 from the last period. That matches the total that were either completed or are going to be sent on to be completed next period. Of these 44,000 units that are completed, we're always going to complete the ones that were already started first, right? So you're going to complete these 2,000 units, leaving 42,000 more that were completed that were started this period. The 3,000 were started this period that were just left for a future period to be completed. You're not showing me that you got it. And you're probably not alone.
One more time.
Somebody want to use a different voice? Who gets it?
Can you just start from the beginning, like where the unit started, and like
Okay.
step by step?
Okay. This is January. You completed partially some work. In January, all the direct materials were put into a product. 50% of your overhead and direct labor will put into that product, leaving 50% to be done in February. Okay? We know in February we completed 44,000 units. And we know on February 28th there were 3,000 units still to be completed. They've already been 100% completed for direct materials because we put all the direct materials in at the very beginning. So that was done in February. And we know that 70% of the direct labor and overhead is also completed for them, leaving 30% of the work to be done in March for these 3,000 units. Okay? 45, all of your inputs need to equal all of your outputs. Your beginning work in process plus some number, 45, is equal to 44 plus 3. These are your outputs. They're either completed or they're going to next period.
45 you just threw out there? Or what?
No, it's math. It's all of your inputs. You're either getting something from last period or you're starting at this period. And so we're calculating what was started this period. And that's 45. It's math. It's 2,000 plus 45. Your inputs equal your outputs. So I calculate. Plus 45 is 47 equals 47. All of your inputs have to equal all of your outputs. Okay? That's accounting for the physical units. That's step 1 of the process.
Oh, so it all adds up to 45.
It all adds up to 47. Okay, so we got that. Now we're trying to determine what happened to these units during February. What happened? Well, 2,000 units came over from January, right? They were the first ones to be finished. They were already finished for materials. They needed to be finished for conversion costs. That's 2,000. We know we completed 44,000 altogether, right? Because it's given. So that left 42,000 that were completed in February that were also started in February because they were not brought over from January. So 42,000 were started and completed in February. Does that make sense? You got that? Okay. And then 3,000 were started in February. These are the last ones to start. They were started on February 22nd, and we couldn't get done with them. They'll be finished in March. That's given there. But they were started in February. So we now have kind of a picture of all of our units in this case. And these 3,000 units that will be completed in March were already completed for direct materials because we add all the direct materials at the beginning, and that was done on February 22nd. And for labor and overhead, they're 70% complete. Let's go forward, and hopefully that will help. Okay, so we'll do the same example for weighted average and FIFO, and we'll take a break after weighted average. Okay, so Naftel Toy Company has 2 production departments, molding and finishing. Molding places direct materials into production at the beginning of every process, so it'll be 100% complete at the very beginning of the process. And direct labor and overhead are incurred at the same, are incurred throughout the process with different proportions. So this case will not think about conversion costs. Since the percentages are different, direct labor and overhead will be different. Here's what we know. Very similar instruction to what we just saw. This is June based, so this is what happened in the month of June. There were 10,000 units that came in at the beginning of the month. Direct materials was completed for each of those units because it's always done at the very beginning of the process. Labor is 30% complete and overhead is 40% complete for those 10,000 units. The value of that beginning work in process inventory, which we'll use later, is 12,680. We started another 40,000 units this month. We completed 44,000. 6,000 left over, right? Our sum of our inputs, 10,000 and 40,000, is equal to 44,000 and 6,000, which is our outputs. That makes sense. Those 6,000 units that are still out there, the direct materials are 100% complete because that goes in at the beginning of each process. So we've completed direct materials for those units. Labor is 50% complete and overhead is 60% complete on those units. And information we'll use later are the costs that were incurred during the month of June. Now, as I said, the weighted average approach counts costs from the previous month. So the weighted average approach is going to include this 12,680 in the total cost. That's the approach we're doing right now. The step one is to account for the physical units. The numbers are all here for us. Our inputs equal our outputs. The work in process that came in on June 1st, plus the units we started, equal the units we've completed, and our work in process on June 30th. That's the end of step one. Step two is calculating equivalent units using weighted average. We know we completed 44,000 units. We're going to count the work that was done last period in the weighted average approach in our equivalent units. So we need to account for all 44,000 units completed for direct materials, labor, and overhead. We kind of ignore this stuff. We just assume that we're going to add that in to our math. That's what weighted average does. Then you have the work in process. This is work that you've done this month for work that will be completed next month. Direct materials is 100% completed, labor 50%, and overhead 60%. So the equivalent units of materials is 6,000. 100% of 6,000. Labor is 50% of 6,000, or 3,000, and 60% of 6,000, or 3,600. And you have total equivalent units for each of the three areas that you're calculating costs for. The important difference between weighted average and FIFO. Weighted average includes all of this stuff from last period. So we're including the equivalent units. We have to include the costs as well. This was the hardest part right here. That's step two. Going to come back to this. Step three, determine the total cost for each element. Materials, labor, and overhead. As I said, it's the costs added this month. These are all given, by the way, in the original slide that you saw. So the costs added this month plus the costs of the units that were accrued last month for the units that were in process at the beginning of the month. That's the 12,680 plus the 1,000 or 110,000. So the total cost you need to account for is this 122,000 because we've calculated that number of equivalent units. That's step 3. Step 4. So we have the total cost we need to account for. We have the equivalent units. So you just divide the costs by the equivalent units, and you have a cost per equivalent unit for each cost element, and you add them together in total. So our cost per equivalent unit for this product is $2.53. The total cost to account for. And in weighted average, the total cost to account for is the costs incurred this period plus the costs of the units that you received from the previous period. So that's the total cost to account for weighted average. Divide it by the number of equivalent units, which includes the equivalent units from this period plus the equivalent units from the previous period, which gives you a cost per equivalent unit. Okay, any other questions on this slide? So now you're assigning some costs here. The goods that you've completed this period, there were 44,000 units completed, and we saw that the full cost of those units was $2.53 per equivalent unit. So your cost of your completed units are $111,320. Then you have to, so those are your finished goods, essentially, using accounting terms. Then you have the work that's still in process. We know our equivalent unit costs. We know the equivalent units of the work that's in process. 6,000 for direct materials because it's all done. Half of the direct labor and 6/10 of the overhead at the specific cost per equivalent unit of each. So this is your work in process that gets transferred to the next period. $11,400, which should match the total costs that we're accounting for. So remember that 122,720. This plus this, the original numbers, 122,720. We've accounted for all the costs. I get that you all need to do some practice in order to really get this. Here's what I want you to do. Work with your team, answer this question, take a break. We'll come back at 5:02.